word.
Where did we
Yeah.
stop with? I think I know where we stopped with it, but I'm used to be if the media uncovered something about like this about you, that was the end of your career. That was it. You left in complete and utter shame. If you remember things like Gary Hart, right, where these
Sure.
moments where you're captured doing something morally unsavory,
You know,
and
David K. Johnston is making a point in the private chat. I almost want to bring, can I bring him on now? And then, yeah. David K. Johnston, everybody, the Pulitzer Prize winner. David is making the point that the GOP should take some responsibility for this. Same thing if he were a Democrat and was doing this. Is that your point, David?
Yeah, parties used to do some vetting of their own candidates, and this guy's complete fabrication of his background, combined with the inexplicable source of his funding, I think falls partly on the party. And since this was the second time he ran, it's partly on them. It's also partly on news organizations. The gay Democrat who lost to the gay, apparently Republican Santos, tried to get news organizations, including the New York Times and others, to pay attention during the race, and he couldn't get anybody to pay attention. So I'm glad this story came out. But you are exactly right. On a congressional district level, only a local newspaper would do this kind of vetting. If you're in a metropolitan area with, as the New York Times metro market is, 30, 40, 50 members of Congress, you're not going to do that. But we should always do it for president. And Trump was never scrubbed, except by pretty much me, in the 2016 campaign. He certainly wasn't scrubbed by the New York Times because an editor of mine who worked there at the time said to me, everybody knows he's a crook. And I said, no, everybody in Manhattan knows that.
Right. That's such a key distinction, David K. Johnston. I think the New Yorkers always viewed him as a joke. And those of us who, were New York adjacent voted, but he really was allowed to get up ahead of steam with all his BS about being a successful businessman. He was anything but. Go ahead.
And no one reported on, for example, the fact that he was up to his eyeballs with an international cocaine trafficker. That's a whole chapter in my biography, The Making of Donald Trump, and did things that are absolutely make no sense whatsoever unless he was in business with him. And then what he did makes perfect sense. Nobody looked into at the time how he cheated investors in Southern California and Arizona and Florida and Colorado. And they kept calling him a Christian and didn't mention that he wrote 6 pages in his book, Think Big, calling Christians fools, idiots, and schmucks, and declaring his life philosophy to be one word that is aggressively anti-Christian: revenge.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so true. He lives by it, doesn't he?
Nobody reported this stuff. And it was one of the biggest failures in my life that I couldn't get other people to pay attention.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it's not your job necessarily to make so much noise that people pay attention. There was also and then what I want to get to, you just have an incredible takedown of what he did with the tax story, and I want to get to that because I just think it's the kind of detail that you understand and maybe can bring it home to us. But I also think, David, he was so good for business. I really just remember how all of a sudden you have news organizations that were struggling. All of a sudden they weren't struggling anymore. You had New York Times subscriptions at record levels. Same with the Washington Post. You heard Les Moonves, who at that time was CEO of CBS, talking about how he was good for business for CNN, MSNBC. They all had the record viewership. Yep. So there was, I don't know if it was subconscious, whether it was conscious or what, to not, kill the goose that is laying the golden eggs.
Well, I think the biggest part of this was an inability to understand that Trump was not a politician. He was a con artist and wannabe dictator. Because if you go back and reread, and I've been rereading a lot of the 2015 and 16 coverage, it operated from the assumption that, well, he's just a different kind of politician. He's not a politician. He never did one day of public service before he took the oath of office in 2017. And the framing of who he is and his position, that's what was just completely missed. And remember, the New York Times editor-in-chief and publisher did a front page boxed mea culpa a couple of days after the election, acknowledging they had completely screwed up. They didn't grasp the frustration and anger of the people who voted for Trump, which I also wrote a great deal about why people are going to vote for him, on economic terms, on racial bigotry terms, and on religious terms, because many of the people in America who call themselves Christians are anything but, and embraced him. But the coverage of Trump in 15 and 16 was abominable. The Washington Post did a book on Trump that has lots of useful information in it, and it's a real snoozer. It is written in the most, you don't want to waste your time reading this book style I can imagine, even though it's graceful.
Yeah, there was so much there. Actually, the Trump story is a sexy story. You know, you do detail it in your books about Trump, and yet somehow the media didn't pick up the sexy. They like to cover the horse race. And here was a guy, an outsider, you know, he's going to shake up the field. And he's a smack talker. And that's really fun to watch, you know, when he's smack talking Bush and Marco Rubio on that big stage when he was first making his run. It was just good sizzle, you know, and I feel like the media succumbs to that.
Yeah, politics reporters behave like everybody else. They respond to the incentives in front of them. And the incentives for politics reporters have nothing to do with covering policy and everything to do with who's ahead in the horse race today, despite the fact that that's kind of nonsense. We know, I just went to a speech by one of the leading pollsters in America about why you shouldn't believe political polls, because only 1% of the people they call answer the phone. And that means they're not getting random samples anymore.
They're trying to, as you know, do texting and trying to refine some of the polling techniques. But you're right. They're flawed to the point that you can see in the midterms how they had some pretty big holes in them. Although we had Jim Avila, the former ABC senior correspondent, who's a regular political contributor here on Fridays, and he said there will be no red wave. He said if you just look at the registration of women since the reversal of Roe, and he said this is a real effect, and you're going to feel it. And young people. He also pointed to that demographic. So there was evidence out there, but you're right. The polling is so horribly flawed. I want to ask you about this piece that you have at dcreport.org, and of course, David, Pulitzer Prize winner, best-selling author, and a co-founder of DC Report, singular, dcreport.org. And then I will promise, before David leaves, I will ask him about the weather in Rochester. Trump took tax losses that he knew were fraudulent. And I wonder if you could sort of break this down, because we see the dump that was all of these the taxes that finally have been released, you know, in drips and drabs, and then now this breakdown that you've provided, and you suggest it's a very basic scam that he was running.
So in the years 2015 through 2020, when Trump was a candidate for 2 years and president for 4, he reported positive income, money flowing into his bank accounts of $152 or $153 million. But his tax returns on the last line of the front page, that's what's called adjusted gross income, the last line on the front page of your tax return, he reported negative $53 million. So how did he turn this gain into a $200 million wipeout? Well, some of the techniques he used are lawful. There are ways that I've written about for years that people, particularly in real estate, can make money off the tax system, because we have rules, especially a rule Donald Trump lobbied Congress for in 1992, that allow real estate developers to live tax-free if they're smart and they know what they're doing, or have good advisors in the case of Trump. But Trump did something else. He didn't limit himself to lawful ways. And I think the most important one, because it's easy to get a jury to convict on, is that on 26 different filings over those 6 years, he reported he had a business that had no revenue, didn't make any sales, but took huge deductions, huge expenses. Now, why is that significant? Because in 1984, Trump did the same thing. 1984 was his biggest year up to that point. His first casino just opened in Atlantic City. Trump Tower apartments were selling like hotcakes because he didn't ask who you were. So all sorts of mobsters and other unsavory people who couldn't get a place in other buildings in Manhattan were paying really big prices compared to other places. And he filed what's called a Schedule C. That's the tax return for a sole proprietorship. That's what my writing business is, a sole proprietorship. He filed a Schedule C with zero revenue and over $600,000 of deductions, which would have saved him at the time, at the federal level alone, about $220,000 in taxes. He got caught by auditors for New York State and New York City. He appealed. There were 2 trials. He lost both. The judges wrote scathing opinions of what he was doing and imposed penalties and interest. And in one of the 2 cases, Jack Mitnick, who had been the Trump family tax lawyer and tax accountant for decades, was shown the tax return in question and asked about its authenticity. And he looked at it, and it did not have what's called a wet signature mark. That's where you, with an ink pen, this is obviously digital, you had to, with it, a blue or black ink pen, sign your name, attesting to your tax return. It had a photocopied signature. And Mitnick looked at it and said to the judge, "That's not my signature. Neither I nor my firm prepared this tax return." In other words, Donald Trump is a forger. Surprisingly, he did not get referred for criminal prosecution for forgery. But what's significant is, having been told that technique, claiming you had a business that there's no evidence it existed, had no revenues, no receipts, no calendars showing appointments, trying to get clients, no indication of expenditures to earn money. That's fraud. He got told that twice, which means he's on notice. And to do that 26 times as a candidate and as president is clear and persuasive evidence of criminal tax fraud. And the point I make in the column is that if you bring a kitchen sink tax prosecution of all the bad things he did, jurors might get lost in the esoteric world of tax. Tax is hard.
Yeah.
But if you just brought a case on this and maybe the fake charitable deductions he took, juries get that, and you could get a conviction easily.
The reluctance to do that, David, is associated with just the institutions of the presidency, right?
I think that is a distinct part of this. But, one of the questions people are asking on Twitter, where I linked to this, is why didn't auditors catch him? Well, the way the IRS works, if you audit someone who's cheating, but after you audited them, they would still have negative income, that means no money's going to come to the government, and the auditor doesn't get rated for bringing in money, for successfully finding things. So long as Trump has a negative, what's called a net operating loss carry forward, there's no point in auditing him. There may be more money for the government, but it would be years down the road. And then secondly, and I'll have a piece about this shortly, the most recalcitrant, uncooperative, non-compliant taxpayers who are rich, if the government comes and audits them, they just immediately spend money making life difficult. Well, we can't find those documents. It's overly burdensome. Let's go get a judge. Why should we have to produce these records? And they just chew up resources. So what does the IRS do? Well, it does what all bureaucracies do. You go after the easy, low-hanging fruit. It's easier to catch a ring of bicycle thieves than a ring of dedicated fraudsters who lift money from you in sophisticated ways. So that's what the police do. And the IRS are the tax police.
Yeah, that's really, when you put it that way, it's, you'd think they want recalcitrant. You're right, is a ding word. You'd think they'd want the Moby Dick kind of, you know what I mean? The big takedown. But you're saying no, it's just why?
When they get a big case, there's a multi-billion-dollar case going on. Almost always, every big case I've looked at in detail, it was a spurned spouse or mistress or business partner who got cheated. And so they took all the records they had and went to the IRS. It's not from audits. And that's a really important point. I see on the screen, people have asked a couple of questions. If you can go back one or two, Mark.
Yeah, I'm not, I don't know who's putting them up there. Is that Albert or Kim or, but I don't know.
I mean, the Republicans so far have given Trump a pass. I agree, although they're starting to try and pull away from him. Sadly, they should have stuck to their guns on January 7th, but they didn't. When will the IRS commissioner be fired? Boy, that's a really good question. Since 1924, because of two scandals, the famous Teapot Dome scandal and a different scandal involving a Michigan senator, Congress has had for itself, through the tax committees, the right to inspect any tax return, a right the president has always had. Donald Trump could have just written a short note to the IRS saying, I want David K. Johnston's tax return, not even explaining why, and they would turn it over. But they didn't turn over Trump's tax returns when requested by Congress. Trump kept saying, well, this is political, it's this and that. He created the grounds for this. He said he was being persecuted by the IRS for being a Christian, and that as president, he was being treated unfairly, which absolutely means Congress should be investigating. And the decision not to turn over the tax returns, if we had sworn testimony, I am sure would be at the feet of Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary. But under the regulations, it is the IRS Commissioner, Charles Rettig, who was supposed to turn them over. Charles Rettig is the first person to be IRS Commissioner whose previous employment was helping tax cheats avoid indictment and to pay less money than they really owed, the very kind of thing I described a moment ago. And he could have resigned in protest. He could have gone back to his multi-million-dollar annual practice and said, you know, much as I've been working to straighten the IRS up as best I can, and I think he's been pretty good at that, he didn't resign, which means he's complicit. And this was simply a lawless administration. And they did not audit him except for 1 year after the House Ways and Means Committee Chairman, Richie Neal, asked, was he being audited, because the law says the president and vice president will be audited each year. And then they only had one auditor who was not allowed to talk to any of the specialists. The IRS employs all sorts of specialists, people who are deeply expert on history, engineering, chemistry, things they would need for tax returns. And he was barred from talking to them. So it was a fraud, not an audit.
Well said. The other thing that was bizarre is the audits that went down for Wray and for Comey, which defied supposedly random audits, yet they show up on these two guys who became Trump adversaries. That's the way Trump saw them anyway.
Well, you know, the official position of the government is that both the Congress and the executive is, it's just random that these two people were picked for an exceptionally rare kind of highly detailed audit. And the first thought I had about that was that years ago, there was somebody who won a big gambling game. I think it may have been a super bingo in Reno twice. And this was back in the 70s when I was in San Francisco for the LA Times. And it very quickly developed that, well, no, the fix was we had somebody who won one of the big national lotteries a few years ago twice. And again, the fix was in. And to think that these were really random and that was these two critics of Donald Trump who got put through the ringer had to, in the kind of audit that James Comey, the former FBI director, and his successor went through, you literally are asked to produce a check or receipt for everything you have. If you were to have taken the earned income tax credit because you were in the working poor and you brought your child's report card to school and the record showing your address, they would say, no, that's not adequate. You need to get sworn statements from neighbors and people in the building and bus records to prove your child actually lives with you, not with somebody else. I mean, these are my first front page story in the New York Times was about what are known in common parlance as audits from hell. And they're ostensibly done for research purposes. But in this case, nah, I'm sorry, I'm a skeptic.
Yeah. It was. It seems that skepticism well applied. It's Comey and McCabe, by the way. I think I said Ray. Yeah. All right, quickly, the weather in Rochester, what has it been like? Tell me.
Well, in Buffalo, which is an hour west of me by car, it's absolutely horrible. I believe the death toll is now over 30. If you go to my Twitter feed, at David CAYJ and go down a couple, you'll see a beautiful photograph that one of my daughters-in-law took of a bull's head nature created that they passed as they went from to the Toronto region down here on the day before Christmas or Christmas Day. In Rochester, I can see my lawn. The snow's all over in Buffalo. And in Syracuse, 80 miles east of here, where I teach at the law school, same thing, a lot less snow. But for people in Buffalo has already received this year, or Orchard Park, where the Bills Stadium is,
Sure.
more than all the snow it normally gets in a season. Yes, on the screen is this wonderful photograph. If you scroll up a little bit, there you go, a bull's head that nature crafted with wind.
Yeah, that's wild. Look at that right there.
Very cold here. Unfortunately, I forgot to take the pump for my waterfall in my gardens out, so I probably have to buy one in the spring.
If that's the biggest casualty of the winter, you've done well compared to most others.
All those deaths in Buffalo, many of them we're going to probably find out were preventable if people had listened to the advice. When the authorities tell you because of a rain or wind or snow, don't go out of your house, go to a building, listen to them, follow the advice.
Yeah. All these families that are stranded in cars, I shouldn't say all of them, but many of them shouldn't be in the cars to begin with. DCReport.org is where you can read David's stuff. Great piece on the Trump taxes that breaks it down in a way you haven't seen anywhere else. He's here on Tuesdays with us. David K. Johnston, the Pulitzer Prize winner. Thanks, David. Happy New Year.
Thank you, Mark.
All right. Good times.
The Mark Thompson Show.
And now, how about it?